We're now less than a month away from Splatoon 3's release, and I wanted to do something I actually originally had planned to do with Splatoon 1, but ended up not doing. I wanted to give a final review. As opposed to the typical game reviewer, I have quite a bit of experience with this game, varying experience actually, having competed in tournaments and really paid attention to the game's balance overall. So that's what this video will be, a review of Splatoon 2 after the many years of having played it. This video will separate sections of the game, so if you aren't interested in hearing me talk about a certain part of the game, be sure to check for the chapters visible in the YouTube timeline so you can jump to where you want. So let's just get started with the part of the game that I began with, the single player mode. While I've made my opinions on the standard hero mode known, I do still want to go over it in this video. Despite me thinking it's a bit of a disappointment, it still does better than Splatoon 1's hero mode. The fact that each level can be completed with every weapon really changes things, even though you have to finish them to be able to do it. Playing every level with a weapon to unlock its hero replica is also a pretty fun idea. The story involving Callie being taken is an interesting idea, and has its ties to the final Splatfest of Splatoon 1, is also a good way to incorporate the idea of the world aging and these events actually happening in universe. Like every other Splatfest really happened in their life, and this final one is just what caused a bit of a shift between them. The overall execution of the story mode is a bit bland. Again, I've made my opinions on this before clear. Where it really shines for me though is in the final boss. Splatoon 1's final boss acted as a well put together test of your abilities, which weirdly didn't happen anywhere else other than the final boss. Splatoon 2 kept that and had the final boss also act as a big final exam. Though I'd argue it was a bit weaker here, it was still a pretty good conclusion to the overall package, especially with how the fight ends off. That was a fun nod to the actual Rainmaker mode. Where the challenge in the final boss really is actually playing with the other weapons. While it is weaker than the first game with just the splatter shot, all the other weapons being options actually ends up pushing it ahead, but just ever so slightly for me. What I'll also always find funny about the story mode is it was where players at launch could go to play the Brella, since it wasn't possible to pick for multiplayer. Story mode was the only way for the Brella to be played, and even if you did all the levels with it, Sheldon would tell players to come back later once the Brella replica was finished. I felt kinda bad for the players who went through all the hoops of grinding it, hoping that they'd get a chance to play it early. In the grand scheme of things though, story mode did expand on things from the first game and did make it more enjoyable, but didn't do a whole lot to make it something truly extravagant. Then again, this isn't a mode for people to play for the single player, so no one could argue that they don't find something extreme and make it super compelling. Not everyone cares about it. To that, I'd say that if they're going to put multiplayer unlocks behind it doing so, you might as well make it fun to do. Hero mode was a fun distraction for me to play as I awaited the release of Splatoon 2 in North America, so I could finally get some matches. But that's what I get for getting the Japanese version. Now this is what we were waiting for. I don't think people expected a DLC expansion for Splatoon 2. People really hoped since Splatoon 1 they'd just make it a way to play as Octolings, especially since they were playable with the use of some hacking. But I digress. This was certainly a better way of just having paid DLC instead of just having it unlock them. Instead we get a full campaign that requires you to finish it if you actually want to play as the Octoling. The biggest area Octo Expansion shines in is the design of the level themselves. Levels where you can mostly go at your own path in terms of which ones you want to do, but levels all exist in a way to test the player in various scenarios and tasks for them to do certain things that they might not do otherwise, even be able to do in multiplayer. Levels that require you to guide like an 8-ball, some challenge to use as little ink as possible. It all ends up being a load of fun. Of course, there's also the optional super boss of sorts. Some people may think the Inner Agent 3 fight as a super boss. Octo Expansion is also known for having a much improved story, with actual challenges and difficulty. People were super excited for it, and rightfully so, since it finally allowed people to play as the Octolings. It was something I certainly enjoyed a whole lot more than the base story, because not only was it more challenging, but the levels themselves offered multiple difficulty options by allowing you to balance the risk and reward by making it harder on you for more points. This allowed players to actively make it more difficult if they felt it was still too easy. The only thing I wish it did was incorporate even more challenges, some levels that offer you only a sub perhaps. While some do actually let you only use a sub, I would have liked it for an option to be for all levels to be done without a main. but I don't know if it would be possible for every level. Some would really need a main weapon, but the challenge would come from only having a sub the entire time would have been pretty cool. The final escape section was done fantastically, stripping you of everything and even any ink to swim in for most of it. It made it super tense. Any damage could quickly become fatal, which makes it a bit more like Metal Gear Solid, a comparison that's arguably been made a bunch, all leading on to the final boss, which oddly enough is a bit underwhelming in comparison to the DJ Octavio fight. Sure, it's not really a fight and more of a race against time, and the area in which you do it is actually pretty cool. The overall boss fight itself is just okay. The scenery is cool, the concept is cool, the fact that they turned Turf War into a final boss is cool. I just wish they had some more substance to it. But what the final boss doesn't do, the Inner Agent 3 fight does. I do wish you could do this fight with other weapons. Like, imagine if, like all the other levels, you were offered a choice of weapon that could already take a challenging fight and make it even more challenging for those that really want a hurting. You could try to do it with only your sub weapon, something I've actually seen attempted, and I do suggest checking it out, but there's no option to do it with like the roller instead, which is a bit of a missed opportunity. But overall, Octo Expansion is all the things I hoped the story mode would become, and perhaps maybe Splatoon 3's story will be more in line with Octo Expansion. Now let's get into the multiplayer content, starting with Salmon Run. I remember when they announced it, it was actually pretty exciting. I had spent a lot of time playing Call of Duty Zombies, so to see that Splatoon was getting its own Horde mode style game mode, it was actually pretty cool to see. However, it ended up falling flat in one area, not being endless. While not the biggest deal and is ultimately a little blemish on a mode that is otherwise pretty fun when played with the right people, it would have been even better if it actually had an endless mode. I understand why there isn't an endless mode. The devs had to take into account the people that might be playing in handheld and might be slightly on the move. So you can't expect these players to dedicate what might be hours to a run. So they went with a limited system to ensure games didn't last too long. Salmon Run provides an interesting type of challenge. Granted, I'm looking at this from the perspective of someone who's basically always been the highest rank in Salmon Run. Played at the highest level, it genuinely becomes a nightmare, which is exactly what you want. When you play at max level, even me who has played this game competitively at the highest level will still struggle in Salmon Run at that height. It really does provide a good challenge and can be super enjoyable if you're playing with the right people. Doing the freelance work and having to play with randoms can be a bit of a pain. You might get some people that know the small ins and outs that make it really easy and a lot more enjoyable at the higher levels. Then there's also the weapon selection, which can be played normally, is limited to a selection of weapons chosen beforehand. Sometimes you might get every weapon has a chance to appear, and then the real fun rotations of all the Grisco weapons. The limited pool also adds to the difficulty. While I think choosing your weapons would make climbing easier, it does actually take away from the challenge a bit. And granted, I'm not even good at this mode. There are people who've spent these years grinding this mode, coming up with strats, knowing what to do and when to do it. High-level Salmon Run is actually an entirely different beast from high-level competitive play. I've seen videos of people casually doing the higher hazard levels, ones I could barely survive through, and it actually baffles me. The amount of skill these people have is highly commendable. Varied events that can occur do mix up what might be seen as a standard zombie mode affair, along with the bosses that appear over the course of a game. It really does become a game of balancing what is and isn't more important to kill and what risks are and aren't worth taking. Salmon Run is also a solid way to grind chunks and tickets. The old tricks of farming the same tickets in hero mode no longer work, and thus has left Salmon Run in a bit of a nice little spot of being a fun, engaging way to grind for those tickets. I haven't even mentioned the special gear you get for playing it. Specific gear that have a bunch of different main abilities, and I actually used to use a piece of Salmon Run gear as a part of my Octoburst kit for years because how good it looked and the main I got on it. Salmon Run does have a lot of room to improve, more events, more bosses, more mechanics, and maybe even finally having that endless mode. Thankfully, we do know most of this is actually being addressed in Splatoon 3, we just need to wait and see if maybe they actually add an endless mode. And now the section I'm sure most people were waiting for, and what some probably skipped right to, the main PvP multiplayer. Real quick, for those that might not be longtime viewers of mine, or maybe those that just clicked on this randomly, I know a fair bit of my views actually don't come from subs. I used to be a competitive Splatoon player. I played competitively throughout the entirety of Splatoon 1's competitive life, and was a part of a high-level team. Splatoon 2 was a chance for me and my team to show that it wasn't just some meta nonsense that carried us in the first game. So I paid a lot of attention to the balance, the meta, the data, and all of that when the game launched. In fact, a lot of the stuff like frame data we have and early stats came from work from people like me. So why am I saying this? It's because it actually gives perspective on my views of the multiplayer aspect of this game. Now, I won't go into every detail about every iteration of the game, every patch, every meta. That would take too much time. But if you are curious about learning each step of the meta and the patch breakdown, ProChara does have a series on his channel that's about just that. I'll link it in the description. Instead, I'm going to cover 3 points of my competitive timeline. Point 1 is early game, the first year or so. Point 2 is post-competitive, the era in which I actually stopped playing in tournaments and actively stopped competing. And then finally point 3, which is post-patch and the era in which the game ended balance changes. I separate them because each point had drastic changes in how I viewed the game and how much time and effort I actually put into it. So let's just get started with the first point. As mentioned, I played competitively going into Splatoon 2, so it'd be a given that I'd play a lot. Early Splatoon 2 was a wild west of what was good and bad. We shifted from a meta of low risk with quick respawn and stealth jump into something people would hope would be more mobility based. I remember tons of people hoping swim speed up and run speed up would be the king of all abilities, and people would run them like they would be. But little did we know that it actually ended up not mattering. Famously, Tri-Slosher was meta at launch, armor was busted, and Tri was so good and had such a great kit. At launch, there were lots of talks about latency and input lag, something that even had a website made dedicated to calling out Nintendo for it. This greatly affected the weapon choice for a lot of people. People who could really feel the delay opted out of using more precision-based weapons. I feel like this is actually something that aided in the Tri-Slosher's rise to dominance. Ink Armor being OP at launch definitely helped for sure though. If I were able to rate the balance of early days, I'd sum it up as wacky. Back in Splatoon 1, Nintendo wasn't afraid to make vast changes and just hit something hard with a nerf as they tried to figure things out. With Splatoon 2, they did launch the game with it being slightly more balanced overall than what Splatoon 1 launched as, though there were still some signs of a company still figuring out what to do. Again, famously with their changes to the Stingray. Especially at launch and the test fire that was widely considered to be bottom tier, instantly became a top tier must pick with only a few patches. These changes were so drastic that Stingray became meta for years, and Nintendo spent those years carefully trying to tune it back without flat out reverting everything. The one thing I've started to think about more recently, however, is if Stingray was actually really bad at launch, or if we were the bad ones. Now don't get me wrong, launch Stingray was weak. You couldn't even move with it. But maybe we were wrong. Or I could be wrong. Who knows? At its core, Splatoon 2's multiplayer did what it needed to do with addressing questionable choices made in the first game, while still making some weird choices that changed our perspective of certain weapons. Many people might not have liked the early metas. They did allow us to see something that had only been memed about in the community for years. The arrow spray was actually meta for a bit. Now let's talk about my post-competitive era. This was the time I spent less playing and more watching. The team I played for had mutually agreed to disband, and I decided to focus on playing games I had missed out while grinding away. While I wasn't playing the game near as much, I, again, watched it a lot more. One downside of being the one playing in tournaments is you don't actually get to see the other people you play against. This finally gave me a chance to become a viewer, a spectator, and I even commentated on a few tournaments during this era of my playtime. This era also allowed me to notice a bunch of flaws in the competitive side. Nothing with the game itself, just how our scene did certain things with tournaments, but that's not for this video. This point is that where I slowly started to fade away from making videos, as I did also stop playing nearly as much. I also spent a lot more time working on another thing I was a part of, something that at the time was a secret project, but now is not only out, but finished. Chugga Conroy's Let's Play of Splatoon 2. I had been helping with that since before Splatoon 2's launch, and I got to really sit down and focus on what made the meta more than what I did before. During this time, the game balance-wise was starting to finally take shape, where patches rarely made massive changes to what was played aside from new weapons that came out. Then we get into the more modern era of Splatoon 2. During this time, I had returned to the competitive scene as a coach. This would be considered like the third point, and was approached to coach the team Prophecy, who at the time was sponsored and playing under the name Supernova. This point also had a lot more watching the game than playing. Balance-wise, the game really slowed down to the point where we went from having a patch like every month or two to we'd be lucky to get a patch at all. And most of the time, it was just special cost adjustments. It did, however, see the rise of 10 missile spam. People had really caught on to how annoying it could be after all the buffs it got. Nowadays, the high-level play is centered around shooters more than any other class. At the highest point, the meta has sort of stabilized and formed, but there's still room to change. Room that could be further worked upon if only there wasn't another entry just around the corner. If I were to compare the balance of Splatoon 2 to the balance of Splatoon 1, sure, 2 handled it a lot better. The first game's balance was so volatile just from it being a new venture for Nintendo. Massive shifts, massive nerfs, massive buffs, crazy kits. It showed the signs of being a first to go. While Splatoon 2 had its fair share of annoying metas, they ultimately didn't have the level of annoyance the first game had. No meta in Splatoon 2 was worse than the worst metas of the first game, even during the height of the Stingray meta. I would still take that over the original Kraken meta where you just couldn't do anything about it. Casually, I feel like 2 has done a lot better as well. Even casuals complained about quick respawn stealth jump meta in Splatoon 1, and they didn't even have to experience the worst of it. Where Splatoon 2 has really faltered is in its rank system, which has been criticized for being too forgiving, but I've talked about this before, so I won't deep dive into it, but I do agree that it needs to be fixed and tuned again for the third game. Oh, and I didn't even mention Clan Blitz, the newest mode added in Splatoon 2, but what do I think of it? I've actually gone a bit into it in previous videos, but I feel in general Clan Blitz does not work in solo. People like to give Rainmaker flack for being too coordination based for solo, but Clan Blitz is actually more coordination dependent. In solo, I think Clan is one of the most unenjoyable experiences, but when played with people you know and can coordinate pushes and strategies, Clan Blitz actually turns into a lot of fun. There's a lot more nuance to Clan Blitz than many people think, and when you can really make use of these aspects, then it greatly improves. But when you have to hope and pray your teammates know these things and can execute on them, it's not so much. The only time I've ever enjoyed solo Clan Blitz is when I got other competitive players on my team, and I knew I could trust them to do the things I do and follow up on what I'm doing. Otherwise, it's a massive crapshoot, and I don't find that to be fun. It's a mode where I feel like it wasn't designed to be played in a solo manner, even though it's a ranked mode. It's something I can only really find the fun in when playing with others I know in coordinated play. Splatoon 2 was a needed follow-up, a second chance for a franchise to begin and take off on a platform that didn't just immediately sink itself. The developers took their time to improve on the game a fair bit, and ultimately addressed a ton of issues people had with the first game, while still having some they can fix the next time around. Splatoon 2 gave us some pretty wild metas, an easier way to host LAN events, a better private lobby system, and more fleshed out squad mode. It was overall a great step in the right direction. While I'm very nostalgic for the old days of Splatoon 1, the second game just did everything better. There were some things that I didn't touch on here, like the things mentioned before with the private lobby and the LAN mode. The devs showed that they did want to encourage a competitive scene, even if so far they've only really given us breadcrumbs in comparison to what they showed in the original Switch reveal. As we approach Splatoon 3, I have hopes that the little gripes I do have will be addressed in some way. There's lots of people concerned about the direction since at the time of making this, they still haven't shown us a whole lot outside of Salmon Run and some Turf War gameplay. But I still have hopes and expect the third game to improve on the foundation set by the original. Splatoon has the makings of a series that could continue for a while. The hook and draw of the game is so simple that it can attract anybody to give it a shot, but also offers a level of depth that not many shooters today can. If I had to give Splatoon 2 a score in the traditional scoring system, I'd actually give it an 8.5 out of 10. The problems I have are tiny, but do mean enough to me to keep it from being a 10 out of 10. Not too big that it knocks it down a ton though. An improved story and rank system would go a long way for the third game, and are only really small blemishes on an overall fantastic sequel to one of the unexpected hits Nintendo would put out in recent years. So with that, I want to thank you all for watching, and I'll see you all next time for my final Splatoon 2 video.